Hey everyone, and welcome to the next segment in this series on how to write a paragraph. In this part, we're going to look at the importance of transitions. In the previous part, we looked at transitions at the end of a paragraph, but it's important to include transitions throughout the paragraph as well. So in this part, we'll quickly look at what transitions are, some different types, how to use them, and some examples. So think of transitions like navigation guides for your readers. They just help the reader progress throughout your logic from point A to point B to point C. You can connect ideas moving forward, or you can link to ideas moving backward. They help the readers make sense out of your ideas by providing meaning and emphasis where needed. Let's look at some examples here. So at the top left, we have similarities, differences, and exceptions. Some examples there might be likewise, or also, in contrast, on the contrary, still, however. At the bottom we have emphasis, so it could be furthermore, more important, primarily. Top right we have order. This could be time order, like next, the day after, later. We could have sequence, so initially, or a simple order like first, second, third. We could have position of the paper, so below I will discuss, or above I mentioned. At the bottom we have different ways of building your ideas. For example, giving examples. That's like for instance, for example, adding, so moreover, in addition, explaining things or concluding, so accordingly. And in the middle here we have cause and effect, so consequently, therefore, or as a result. And of course there are a lot more examples of all of these. One guide that I like in particular is from the University of Washington's Writing Center, but there are a lot of other ones online. I'll add a link to this here so you can access it easily for your reference. But they have longer lists here of most of the categories that we just looked at. I wouldn't say that I would use all of these because some of them are a bit wordy. For example, I probably wouldn't use along the same. Try to use the one word and the more concise options when possible. For example, I would use despite. I wouldn't use despite the fact unless I had to for the structure. Or I would use despite instead of in spite of, because the former is more concise. But you get a lot of good ideas here to change up your wording a little bit because we all have tendencies to use the same types of words. But this list goes on here: sequence, addition, intensification, and some different things down here at the bottom. So again, I'll put a link to that so that you can start to use some different ideas in your writing. Okay, so now that we know what transitions are, let's look at how to use them. The first thing you want to do is make sure that your ideas are in a logical order to begin with. If they're not organized well to begin with, it won't matter whether you use transitions because it won't make any sense. So once your ideas are in order, then you can add those transitions in. Those are the words that we looked at in the list previously. And you don't have to use a transition word in every sentence because that can sound a little bit robotic. But in a lot of cases they are necessary and quite helpful. So you have to be able to anticipate a bit where the reader is going to need some guidance and put those signposts in for them. Then after you've got all of your transitions in there, of course you want to put your document down, go do something else, go to sleep, look at it the next day, and this will help you see if all the links are there, because when you're doing your research and your writing, you have a lot of the ideas in your head, and it's very easy for you to see how point A is connected to point B and how everything connects to your overall argument, but the reader doesn't always have those connections in their head. So if you put your document down and you come back and look at it, you'll be able to catch a lot of things, not just grammar, spelling, conciseness improvements, and other issues. But I think one of the biggest things you'll be able to see is whether the ideas connect logically, because you force your brain to look at your own writing again without those connections. So the longer you can let your document sit, the better, and you'll be able to see those gaps in logic a little more easily and fine-tune all the connections for your reader. All right, let's take a look at a few examples. So this paragraph has a couple of issues, both in the order of ideas and missing transitions. So if you want to put your video on pause here and see if you can come up with one way to solve this, go ahead. There's always more than one answer for these kinds of problems because you can be creative with the language. Okay, so let's take a look at one solution here. So the first part of the problem was that this sentence, gender inequality exists, is more of a topic sentence, so it should be at the beginning of the paragraph rather than the end. So we usually start with a more overarching idea, and then we give the details, data, and specifics, right? So first you might state gender inequality exists, and then a nice way to transition here would just be the simple for instance or for example. among university professors, men are blah, 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 because it's an example. And then the last sentence is more of a concluding sentence to the paragraph. So this is a very simple paragraph, but we get a sense of how the order of events and just a simple transition can make this a lot easier to navigate. Okay, let's look at another one. Again, you can take a moment here and see if you can find some ways to make this a more logical paragraph using basically what you have in a small addition. So go ahead and put your video on pause and take a look. All right, let's take a look at one possible solution here. So again, we have to move our topic sentence to the front. 2 analyses were conducted. This makes more sense out of the paragraph. Then the examples are given, and one analysis was the sample was limited to large banks. The results showed that banks with a board of directors had a significant coefficient for the mean variable. The stats are given. And then we need some kind of transition here. So the example here shows that your transitions don't always have to be a simple word. You can use a clause like this, or you can even use an entire sentence to make a transition between ideas. That's often more helpful than a simple word. Here we could add something like, this result tells us that these banks had higher profit margins than banks without a board. I would say that the phrase these banks wouldn't be so clear if it was by itself, but because the rest of the sentence clarifies the comparison group, then it is clear. And it's much better than this pronoun they, because that actually wasn't clear which one it referred to. So again, this is just some clarity in the example. Let's take a look at one last one here. And this one actually demonstrates a problem that's kind of funny, but I do tend to see sometimes. So take a look and put your video on pause here. So the problem with this paragraph was actually that they just used an incorrect transition. So they had an alternative perspective, but actually the second sentence gives the same perspective in other words. So a more appropriate transition would be in other words. And that might seem like kind of a silly mistake, but I actually do see sometimes people write however when they mean therefore, or vice versa, and it makes the reading very confusing. So make sure you have your own ideas clear in your head before you start putting in the transitions. If everything's in a logical order and you understand it well, then you'll see where you have to put in your signpost for your readers. Okay, so those were just a few examples, but the bottom line is to remember to use your transitions throughout your paragraphs to make it easier to follow the ideas. And you don't always have to use the same 2 or 3 words. There's plenty of transition words available. Remember that you can also use complete phrases and sentences to create your transitions. And all of this will help your reader navigate your ideas much more easily. Okay, so that's it for this part. And in the final part, we'll put some paragraphs together as a whole. All right, see you in the next video.